The border tree had been dead longer than anyone living could remember tending it, and Aveline Duskmere had been sent to bury it properly. That was the whole of her task. Not to save it. No one had asked her to save it. The steward, Osric Velmore, had handed her the ledger with the tree's name written in a hand 3 generations older than his own. The Sentinel, the old records called it, though no one at the keep used that name aloud anymore, the way no one said the names of things they had stopped believing in, and told her plainly that a dead tree standing at the border of the king's territory was an embarrassment to the pack, a rotted tooth in an otherwise proud jaw, and that she was to see it cut down and its roots cleared before the spring council arrived to judge the health of Ashvane land. She had been at the keep 3 years by then, long enough to know which corridors to avoid when the wolves ran hot with moon fever, long enough to mend a hem invisibly and carry a tray without being seen carrying it, long enough that half the household could not have told you her name if pressed, and would have guessed wrong twice before landing on it. She preferred it that way. A castle has room in it for exactly one kind of unremarkable woman, and Aveline had made herself that woman on purpose, the way another person might learn a trade, carefully over years, with a craftsman's patience for a skill nobody else recognized as a skill at all. Her mother had taught her the shape of that invisibility before she died, in the same flat, practical voice she used for teaching Aveline to salt meat or mend a net. Be useful and be unremarkable, and no one will ever look closely enough to ask what you're hiding. It had seemed at 19 like grief-talking. It seemed now, at 21, like the truest thing her mother had ever told her. So when she walked out past the last watchtower, with a spade over her shoulder and a coil of rope for the roots, on a morning cold enough to ache in her teeth, she did not expect anyone to notice, least of all the Alpha King. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always from a careful distance, always in passing. A big, quiet, watchful man who moved through his own hall like a soldier who had never quite trusted architecture to keep him safe. She had no reason to think of him at all that morning, and did not, until the tree changed everything a wolf's nose could measure. The tree stood alone in a frost-bitten clearing where the king's land met the old wood, its black branches bare against a sky the colour of a healing bruise. Even dead, it was enormous, wide enough that 4 men could not link hands around its trunk, tall enough that its highest limbs seemed to scratch at the low clouds. Deep grooves scarred the bark in a pattern too regular to be accidental, an old rune worn nearly smooth by weather, the kind of mark her grandmother used to trace with 2 fingers and never explain, the way old women sometimes touch a doorframe out of habit, long after the reason for the habit has been lost. Aveline set the spade down against a root and did not pick it up again for a long while. She had grown up hearing about the Sentinel, the way children hear about any local ruin, half true, half invented, entirely irrelevant to a life spent scrubbing floors and keeping her head down. The wolf had not chosen a mate since the tree last bloomed, the old women at the well used to say, working the number differently every time they told it, until the number itself became a kind of proof that no one actually knew it. 400 years, some said. Longer, said others, dropping their voices the way people do when a subject has outlived the memory of why it once mattered. No one agreed, which was how Aveline had learned, early, to file it among the stories that exist mainly to keep children afraid of the dark and adults comfortably uncurious. Still, her hand found the bark before her mind decided to let it. The rune was cold under her palm, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season, a deep mineral cold, like touching stone at the bottom of a well. For 1 breath, then 2, nothing happened at all, and she felt foolish for having expected anything, foolish in the particular way of a woman who has trained herself out of expecting things, so that even a moment's hope arrives dressed as embarrassment. Then the cold turned to warmth, fast, like a hearth catching all at once. Golden light bled up through the bark from beneath her hand, following the old grooves outward in a slow, spreading vein, and the whole dead trunk shuddered once, hard, as though something enormous had exhaled after holding its breath a very long time. Frost cracked and fell away in sheets, hissing where it struck the frozen grass. New wood showed pale gold beneath the black, climbing branch by branch, limb by limb, faster than her eye could properly track it. And from every barren twig, at once, small white blossoms unfolded, hundreds of them, then thousands, opening so fast the air filled with the sound of it, a papery rushing like a held breath finally let go. Aveline stumbled back from the tree with her heart slamming and her palms still tingling, and above her the last blossom opened, and the whole clearing smelled impossibly of spring, in a season that had no business producing it. 12 miles away, in the great hall of Ashvane keep, King Rurik went down on one knee in front of his entire war council with no warning at all. It struck him like a physical blow, a wrenching heat under his ribs where his wolf lived, a pull so sudden and so absolute that for one disoriented moment he thought he had been poisoned. His captains were on their feet, hands on hilts, shouting for the physician, and Rurik could not answer them because he did not have words yet for what had happened to him. Only a direction, a place, a certainty, arriving whole and unasked for, the way weather arrives. "Something has bloomed," his wolf said, in the low, wordless way it spoke when it wanted something with its whole body. Something the wolf has waited 412 years to smell. He said the number aloud, without knowing where he'd gotten it. And old Eldrick, the keep's archivist, a man so ancient the younger guards called him a ghost behind his back, went the colour of tallow and had to sit down on the nearest bench without being asked. 412 years, Eldrick repeated, and his voice shook in a way Rurik had never once heard it shake in 20 years of service. "That is the exact figure in the border record, my lord. Since the sentinel last bloomed, since the last true Alpha Queen was chosen by the land itself, and not by any council vote, nor any bloodline claim, nor any arrangement made by men who thought they understood what they were arranging." "You're telling me this is real," Rurik said, already on his feet, already reaching for his sword belt, though he could not have said what he expected to fight. "I am telling you, my lord, that I never expected to live long enough to write that number down twice." Rurik was already moving before the old man finished the sentence, out through the hall, past guards who had not yet finished drawing their weapons, out into a courtyard, where the horses had gone strange and restless in their stalls, ears pinned toward the borderwood, as though they, too, had felt something in the ground shift. By the time he reached the clearing, the light was fading gold to violet, and the tree stood in full impossible bloom against the coming dark, and a woman he did not recognize was sitting at its roots with a cold spade forgotten beside her, staring up into the branches like she expected them to speak. He knew her before she turned. His wolf had known her from 12 miles off, had dragged him across half his own territory, on legs that would not slow, no matter what his human mind told them, and now that he was finally close enough to see her, plain wool dress gone grey at the hem, dark hair escaping its pins, hands scraped raw from years of work no one thanked her for, the animal in him went utterly, helplessly still, the way a held breath goes still just before it's released. "Mine," it said. Not a question, not even a decision. A fact, arriving the way the tree's bloom had arrived. Total, and 412 years overdue. "You're the king," Aveline said, getting to her feet too fast, brushing bark dust from her skirt with hands that would not quite stop shaking. It wasn't a question either. No one else wore that much iron so carelessly, like a man who had forgotten armor could be heavy. "I felt it," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Whatever you did, I felt it happen from the great hall. I was on my knee in front of my own council before I understood I'd moved. I didn't do anything." She looked, genuinely like she believed that. "I touched the tree. I was sent here to cut it down." Something in his chest, the human part, not the wolf, though the wolf agreed, found that very funny and did not laugh. because the moment did not feel like one that wanted laughter in it. "You were sent to kill the one thing on my land that has been waiting 4 centuries for you specifically," he said, "and instead it decided to live." Aveline looked past him at the blossoms, white and improbable in the dusk, and said nothing at all, because she did not have a place in her life where an answer to that could fit. She had spent 3 years building a self small enough to carry through any doorway without drawing a single glance, and now a tree older than the keep stones had decided, without consulting her, that she was the largest thing that had happened to this land in 400 years. "I don't know what you want me to say," she admitted finally, and it cost her something to say it plainly, instead of retreating into the careful, colourless speech she used with everyone above her station. "I'm not sure I know what to ask you yet," Rurik said. "Give me time to learn the shape of the question." Word of the bloom outran the moon that night. By morning it had reached every corner of the keep, distorted a dozen times over in the telling. The border was healed, the old curse was broken. The king had found his true mate at last, after 4 centuries of the pack's slow, unspoken decline. Servants, who had walked past Aveline for 3 years without learning her name, now watched her cross the courtyard the way one watches a comet, with awe, with suspicion, with the particular hunger of people who have just discovered that the world contains more possibility than they had budgeted for. She hated it. She had built her whole life around not being watched, and now she could not walk from the kitchen to the well without a dozen pairs of eyes finding her, weighing her, wondering aloud what a border servant had that 3 centuries of noble daughters had not. The kitchen girls, who had once shared bread with her without a second thought, now fell silent when she entered, and the silence hurt worse somehow than open cruelty would have. Osric Velmore wandered loudest, and unlike the kitchen girls, he did not fall silent. He came to her small room off the kitchens 2 nights after the bloom, uninvited, and set himself in her doorway with the particular stillness of a man who has spent decades learning to look harmless while he calculates. Aveline had disliked him from her first week at the keep. In the vague, instinctive way, one dislikes a floor that creaks under no visible weight, but she had never had reason to fear him until now, when his eyes moved over her the way a merchant's eyes move over a ledger that does not balance. "You understand," he said, his voice pitched low and reasonable, the voice of a man who has never once needed to raise it to get what he wants, "that this changes nothing about who you are." "I never thought it did." "Good. Then you'll understand why the council will need proof before it accepts a border girl as anything more than a curiosity the wolf latched onto by accident." His smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. It sat on his mouth the way frost sits on glass, decorative and cold. Bloodlines can be forged. Trees can be tampered with by someone clever enough and patient enough. Roots can be salted. Seasons can be tricked by hands that know old herb craft. I intend to find out which this is, Duskmere, and I would advise you to hope, sincerely, that the answer flatters you. He left before she could answer, and Aveline sat alone in the dark for a long time afterward, her hand pressed flat against her own sternum, as though she could feel, from there, whatever the king had felt from 12 miles off. She did not sleep. She thought instead, methodically, the way she thought through any threat, about exactly how much of her mother's caution had been founded on nothing, and how much of it had been founded on men exactly like Osric Velmore. She kept the pouch hidden after that. She had carried it since childhood, sewn into the hem of whatever dress she owned, moved with her from one worn garment to the next, without her ever quite deciding to keep it. A small leather pouch, bone-clasped, that had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, containing a single seed no botanist at the keep had ever been able to name, though 2 had tried. In the idle way scholars try things that seem unlikely to matter. Her mother had told her once, in the flat voice of a woman passing on a burden rather than a gift, that it was to be kept and never planted, and never shown, and never explained, because explaining it had cost women in their family more than it had ever given them. Aveline had never told anyone about it, not in 3 years at the keep, not the night the tree bloomed, not the morning after, not when the king himself began finding reasons to cross her path in the corridors that had absorbed her so completely for so long. He did not press her about it. He did not press her about anything, which she found more disarming than any demand could have been. He came to the orchard where the sentinel now stood in full leaf, and he brought no guard and no crown and no explanation, and he simply worked beside her while she cleared the frost-killed grass at the tree's roots, saying little at first, watching everything, the way a man watches a fire. He has been told all his life not to trust too near. "You don't have to keep pretending you're only a servant," he said on the 4th evening, not looking up from the root he was untangling, with hands too large and too careful for the delicate work. "Not with me. I'm not pretending. I am a servant. The tree blooming didn't change my hands." She held them up, scraped and calloused, evidence enough. "It changed how people look at me. That isn't the same thing as changing who I am." He was quiet long enough that she looked over and found him watching her with an expression she did not have a category for. Not desire exactly, though that was somewhere in it, but something closer to the look of a man discovering that a wall he had assumed was load-bearing was, in fact, ornamental, and the whole structure of his life might be rearranged without anything actually collapsing. "I've spent 400 years of pack history being told the mate bond would arrive like lightning," he said quietly. "No one told me it would arrive looking like a woman who thought she wasn't worth noticing, and had gotten so good at proving it that half my household believed her." Aveline's throat went tight. She did not trust her voice, so she did not use it. But she did not look away either, and for a long moment neither of them moved, his hand near enough to hers on the frozen ground that the warmth of it reached her skin before he touched her, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 careful years loosened, just slightly, for the first time she could remember since her mother died. She did not tell him about the pouch that night, but she thought for the first time that she might eventually be able to. In the days that followed, without either of them naming it, a kind of rhythm formed. He would come to the orchard in the late afternoon, when the council business allowed it, and she would already be there, and they would work and talk, and sometimes not talk. And Aveline found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she had stopped rehearsing her sentences before she spoke them for the first time since she was a girl. It did not feel like safety exactly. It felt like the first thaw after a long winter, tentative and cold at the edges, and real. Osric moved faster than either of them expected, and with more preparation than either of them had credited him for. He brought his accusation before the full council 8 days after the bloom, in the great hall, with the winter sun coming thin and cold through the high windows and half the keep crowded in to watch. He had, he announced, spent those 8 days doing what he considered his sworn duty, protecting the integrity of the bloodline records. And he had found a border village midwife willing to swear, before the council and before the king himself, that the Duskmere family had passed something down through its women for generations. Something unnatural, she claimed, under careful questioning he did not describe the terms of. Something that might, in unscrupulous hands, be used to force a false bloom and a false bond, to trick even a wolf's nose the way no honest bloodline should ever need to. "Produce it," he told Aveline, in front of the assembled pack, his voice carrying with practiced ease to every corner of the hall. "If you have nothing to hide, show the council what your mother left you, Duskmere, and let this matter be settled today, one way or the other." The hall went silent enough that Aveline could hear her own pulse, and beneath it, fainter, the low, uneasy murmur of a court deciding, in real time, which way its sympathies would break. She thought, in that silence, of every reason she had never told anyone, of her mother's voice going flat with old fear over a kitchen fire, of women in her family who had learned, generation after generation, that explaining themselves had never once made them safer, only more visible to exactly the kind of man now standing across the hall from her, with his hands folded and his face arranged into patient concern. She thought of 3 years spent perfecting invisibility as a form of protection, and of how thoroughly the last 8 days had undone it, whether she willed it or not. Then she thought of Rurik's hand near hers on the frozen ground, and the particular way he had looked at her hands and called them evidence rather than shame. She thought of the tree blooming without asking her permission, and of how little good it had ever done her family to stay quiet and small and unremarkable, when the world had found them anyway, eventually, every single time. She drew the pouch from the hem of her sleeve, where she had moved it that morning without entirely deciding why, and held it out on her open palm for the whole hall to see. Her hand did not shake. "It's a seed," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake either. "It has been kept, unplanted, for 4 generations, because the women before me were told that keeping it quiet was the only way to keep it safe. I don't know what it is. I never planted it. I never used it on your tree, my Lord Steward, because I didn't know it could be used on anything at all until you stood here today and accused me of it. I have spent my whole life being told that the safest thing a woman like me can do is disappear. I am done disappearing on your account." Eldrick the archivist rose from his bench so fast his stool clattered backward, and crossed the hall with a speed that startled everyone who thought of him as half a ghost already. He took the pouch from her hands with the reverence of a man handling something out of Scripture, opened it with trembling fingers, and went very still, staring down into the small dark seed as though it might yet do something more. "This is a sentinel seed," he said, to the hall, to the king, to Osric Velmore's suddenly uncertain face. "There is one tree of this kind on Ashvane land, and it has not produced viable seed in 412 years, because it has not bloomed in 412 years. The only way this family could have held one, unplanted, generation after generation—" He looked up at Aveline with something like awe, an old scholar's awe, the kind that has waited a lifetime for its object and finally found it. As if an ancestor of hers stood exactly where she stood 8 days ago, and the tree chose her too, and she chose, for reasons this council will never fully know, to walk away from a crown rather than claim it. The hall did not stay silent after that. Osric Velmore tried, in the rising noise, to argue that a seed proved nothing but old theft, that a Duskmere ancestor might have stolen the seed generations ago from some forgotten grove, that theft explained possession as easily as destiny did. But the accusation had cost him more than it had ever threatened to cost Aveline. A steward who brings a false charge against the wolf's chosen mate, in front of the full assembled pack, does not survive the telling of it twice, no matter how carefully he phrases his retreat. Rurik watched him with an expression Aveline had not yet seen on him, not fury, though the wolf beneath it wanted fury, but something colder and more final, the look of a king recalculating, in real time, exactly how much trust he had misplaced over how many years. "You had 8 days," Rurik said to Osric quietly, in a voice that nonetheless reached every corner of the silent hall, "to bring me proof of wrongdoing. You brought me a woman's private grief instead, and called it evidence." He turned to the council. "I want the border ledgers Velmore has kept for the last decade reviewed, in full, by the end of the month. Every entry." By the time the council adjourned, it was Osric's position among the border ledgers, being quietly, comprehensively reassigned, and it was not Aveline standing alone in the hall's aftermath, but Aveline with the king's hand at her back, steady, and Eldrick already murmuring plans for a proper record of the seed's lineage, and half the hall's earlier suspicion, curdling, as suspicion often does, once its object is proven wrong, into something closer to shame. The ledger review took the better part of a month, and what it uncovered was worse, in its quiet way, than any single act of cruelty could have been. Osric Velmore had not merely disliked border families. He had spent a decade routing their grain allotments through his own kin stores, skimming the difference so carefully that no single year's numbers ever looked wrong. Only the accumulated weight of 10 years laid end to end. Families at the border, Aveline's own village among them, in years she had been too young to notice, had gone through harder winters than they should have, quietly, while a steward in a warm keep balanced his books to look clean. Rurik brought the findings to her himself, in the orchard, before he brought them to the council, because he had learned, in a month, that she preferred to hear hard things plainly and early, rather than softened and late. He was starving border villagers by inches to line his own stores, he said without preamble. Yours among them. I wanted you to hear it from me before it becomes something the whole keep discusses over supper. Aveline sat very still on the low stone wall at the orchard's edge, and something in her that had been braced for months, for years, if she was honest, finally understood that the vague, grinding hardship of her own childhood had not been simple bad luck, but a specific man's specific choice, made and remade 100 times without her ever knowing his name until 8 days ago. "What happens to him?" she asked. "Trial before the full council, not a private word from me. I want every border family that lost grain to hear the account read aloud, and I want his punishment decided in public, not quietly settled behind a closed door the way he settled everything else." He watched her carefully. You could ask for something harsher than the law provides, if you wanted it. No one in that hall would refuse you, not after what he tried to do to you in front of all of them. "I don't want harsher," Aveline said after a moment. "I want it accurate. I want the border villages repaid what he took in full from his own confiscated stores, not from the Crown's treasury pretending generosity for a crime it didn't commit. And I want every steward after him to know that border families are not a line item to be quietly trimmed when the numbers run short." Rurik looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face. "That's a queen's answer," he said, "not a servant's." "It's the same answer either way," she said. "I've just never before been in a position to have it heard. Not everyone at the keep accepted the council's verdict quietly. Osric Velmore had kin among the household guard, men who owed their positions to his years of quiet patronage, and in the week before his sentencing, one of them cornered Aveline in the low passage behind the granary, where the torches ran thin and no one had reason to pass after dark. He did not raise a hand to her. The law would have hanged him for it outright, mate of the Alpha King or not, but he stood too close and spoke too low, and told her, in the careful language of a man who has rehearsed his threat to leave no clean evidence of it, that seeds could be lost as easily as they were found, that saplings were fragile things in their first year, that a woman who had already survived one accusation might not survive being blamed for whatever misfortune happened to befall the sentinel next. Aveline did not run and did not shout for guards she could not be certain would come in time. She held very still, the way she had held still for 3 years, learning exactly how much stillness a room required of her, and she said, in a voice that did not waver, that he was welcome to try, and that the last man who had underestimated what her family had survived was currently awaiting sentencing in the king's own dungeon for it. He left her there, eventually, unsatisfied and uncertain, and Aveline walked the rest of the way to her room with her heart hammering and her hands perfectly steady, and told no one what had happened until Rurik found the fear still sitting behind her eyes at supper, and would not let the matter rest until she gave him the whole of it. What followed was not spectacle. Rurik did not tear the granary passage apart looking for the man, did not demand a public reckoning to match Osric's own humiliation. He simply had the man identified by description within the hour, questioned quietly, and removed from the household guard within the day, his patron's remaining influence stripped out of the keep root and branch before it could take hold anywhere else. When Aveline asked him later, Why he hadn't made an example of it the way the council had made an example of Osric. He told her plainly that some threats deserved a public trial to strip them of their power, and some deserved only to be ended, quickly and without ceremony, before they could grow into anything a frightened household might repeat as legend. "You're not going to be the story people tell to keep themselves afraid," he said. "Not in my keep. Not while I'm the one who decides what gets remembered." It was, Aveline thought, the first time in her life a man with real power over her had used it to make a threat against her smaller rather than larger, and she found she did not entirely know what to do with the strangeness of being protected by someone who never once made her feel like something that needed protecting. The sapling by the sentinel's roots was watched more closely after that, not out of fear, exactly, but out of the ordinary, careful attentiveness of people who have learned, the hard way, what it costs to assume a good thing will simply take care of itself. It grew anyway, steady and unremarkable, the way things grow when no one is trying to make a lesson out of them. Spring came properly to Ashvane land after that. In the ordinary, unremarkable way spring comes everywhere. Mud in the courtyard, lambs in the low pasture, the sentinel dropping small hard fruit that Ealdric catalogued with the devotion of a man cataloguing miracles. Though within a season the keep's children were simply eating them off the ground and complaining, the way children do, when there weren't enough to go around. Aveline kept working. She had told Rurik plainly, in the weeks after the trial, that she had no intention of becoming a woman who did nothing but stand beside a throne and be looked at, that she had spent too many years learning to be useful to abandon it now for a life of decoration. And he had told her, just as plainly, that he had come to want a border girl specifically because she had never once, in 3 years at his keep, waited to be told her own worth by anyone standing above her. And he did not intend to start requiring it of her now. Nor did he think the pack would thrive under a queen who had forgotten what an honest day's work cost. So on the morning the border ledgers were finally balanced clean, 6 months after the bloom, it was Aveline who walked them out to Ealdric's study herself. The old bone-clasped pouch, empty now, its single seed long since given to the earth beside its parent tree, where a slim new sapling had already begun its first cautious season of growth, tucked back into the hem of a new dress, out of habit more than necessity, a small private ritual she had not yet found a reason to give up. Rurik found her there afterward, in the orchard, in the last low gold of the afternoon, and did not say anything at all at first. He simply stood beside her, the way he had that first cold evening at the roots of a dying tree, his shoulder a warm line against hers, and together they watched the sentinel's new leaves turn silver green in a wind that carried nothing more urgent on it than the ordinary settled business of a border finally, entirely at peace. Somewhere behind them, faint and familiar now, came the sound of the keep's kitchen girls calling to one another across the courtyard, the same girls who had once fallen silent when Aveline walked past, now simply calling her name among the rest, without ceremony, the way you call to someone who has become, without anyone quite marking the day it happened, ordinary again, in the best sense of the word. 412 years, Rurik said eventually, quiet, almost to himself. "It's just a tree now," Aveline said. "It doesn't have to mean anything anymore. It just gets to bloom." He looked at her, the way he had looked at her that very first evening, like a man discovering that the thing he'd been told to fear his whole life had simply been waiting, patiently, to be allowed to live. Ealdric found them there as the light went fully violet, clutching a fresh page of the border record with the particular urgency of an old man who has decided a thing must be written down before he forgets the precise words he wants to use for it. He did not interrupt them so much as orbit them for a moment, muttering about verb tenses, before Aveline finally laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in years, and asked him what on earth he was trying to say. "Only that the record has always described the trees blooming as an ending," the old archivist said. "The last Alpha Queen, the last time, the final bloom before 4 centuries of silence. I find I no longer know how to write it that way. It was never an ending at all. It was only ever waiting for its beginning to arrive. He looked between them, satisfied in the manner of a man who has finally solved a problem that has occupied him for decades. I shall have to rewrite the whole entry. Take your time, Rurik said. It isn't going anywhere. Ildrick wandered off toward the keep with his page held close, already composing the new lines under his breath, and Aveline watched him go with something loosening further still in her chest, the last of the old caution perhaps, finally deciding it had no further use for her. So, would you have knelt at the roots of a dead tree for a woman the whole world had trained you to overlook, 412 years in the making? Tell me in the comments below.